Good afternoon. I'm Warren Hogue, IPI's Senior Advisor for External Relations, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this policy forum on nuclear weapons, the state of play, co-sponsored by IPI and the Australian National University Centre for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. I am honored to be joined here today by two very distinguished guests. Our speaker is Gareth Evans, formerly Foreign Minister of Australia and President of the International Crisis Group, who is today Chair of the ANU Centre and will be discussing the Centre's new report, which, by the way, is being passed out right now, and we have lots, so feel free to take one. The new report called Nuclear Weapons, the State of Play 2015. As discussant, we have Angela Kane, former UN Undersecretary General for Management, who since 2012 has been High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. The report and this forum today anticipate the meeting beginning Monday across the street at the UN of the 2015 Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. Since the treaty went into effect in 1970, there have been review conferences every 5 years, and accordingly, this review will be focused on developments since the last one in 2010. As you will hear, these have been 5 very impactful years for the NPT, but not in the way it was hoped back in 2010. The NPT is the landmark international treaty whose objective is to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and weapons technology, to promote cooperation in the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and to further the goal of achieving nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament. This is the second edition of this report, and IPI hosted an event in June of 2013 on the release of the first one, also co-authored by Gareth Evans, and at that time we had one of his co-authors, the current ANU Centre Director, Ramesh Thakur, here to present, and Angela Kane was here also that day to help frame the conversation. This publication, which is being passed out, substantially updated version of the 2013 original, is a comprehensive assessment of states' progress, or lack of it, on commitments made at the Nuclear Security Summits of 2010, 2012, and 2014, and at the 2010 NPT Review Conference, as well as on their ongoing efforts to implement the recommendations of the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. This report is meant to be used as an advocacy tool for governments and civil society to advance the global nuclear policy debate. It focuses on 4 main areas: disarmament, non-proliferation, nuclear security, and peaceful uses of nuclear energy. It is a 300 plus page document, and I was going to tell you about how cleverly the design lays it out in a very digestible manner, but that was before I knew that Gareth Evans would be bringing a PowerPoint presentation with him, so you will see it for yourself right now. I find, as a former magazine editor, I find it a very artful design concept to get a lot of information, complicated information, understood quite simply. So with no further ado, I want to call to the stage and ask you to please welcome Gareth Evans.
Well, thanks very much, Warren, for that very generous introduction. Thanks to IPI for hosting this event in association with the Australian National University. Thanks to the Australian government for supporting this enterprise, even though they're not entirely fantastically happy with every last judgment we've made in the document. But Gillian Bird is here as the new Perm Rep to wave the flag if it needs waving in that respect. Thanks particularly to Angela Kane for joining us again today. Angela's been a fantastically effective and articulate High Rep for Disarmament, which is, of course, one of the reasons why she's not fantastically well appreciated by everyone that counts in the disarmament community. But I'm absolutely delighted, as I'm sure we all are, to have her with us today. Let me begin with where we were 5 years ago. And the atmosphere was, as we'll all recall, one of pretty considerable optimism. Optimism, at least, for those of us who want to achieve a world without nuclear weapons, without the most indiscriminately inhumane weapons ever invented. You remember the elements of that optimism we had in President Obama, a newly elected United States president, both intellectually and emotionally committed to a nuclear-free world, and concerned to do something about it operationally by negotiating arms reduction agreements with Russia, securing ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in the Senate, and flagging a significantly reduced role for nuclear weapons in US doctrine. And that was, of course, articulated superbly in his 2009 Prague, April 2009 Prague speech. Following the general optimistic mood of the times, you remember that perhaps that in 2009 we published the report of the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, picking up on the earlier Canberra Commission report, the Blix Commission report and others, in which what we sought to do in this Australia-Japan initiated enterprise was articulate a systematic, realistic agenda for the implementation of the dream of a nuclear weapons-free world. Not too heroic in some of its assumptions about how quickly we could get there, but meticulously careful in identifying ways forward and identifying benchmarks. And it's some of those benchmarks that we'll be reviewing today. That was the atmosphere in 2009 to produce that report. Also in 2010, buoyed by that prevailing spirit, we had the NPT review conference agreeing on a quite substantial program of action items. Modest, I guess, if you're going to be relentlessly objective about it in terms of where the bar was actually set, but not at all modest by comparison with the achievements of 5 years earlier, which were non-existent. You remember the 2005 conference broke up with nobody able to agree about anything. And so that fed into the prevailing sense of optimism. And then we had in that same year, 2010, the New START agreement being reached with Russia, and with Washington also hosting the first of the nuclear security summits addressing the issue of nuclear material getting into the hands of the wrong people. But by the end of 2012, the cut-off date for the first edition of this State of Play report we're launching today, that optimism was beginning to fade rather rapidly. And now, as at the end of 2014, 3-4 months ago, which was the cut-off date for producing this report, I have to say that optimism has almost completely disappeared for all the reasons that are documented in the report, which I'll take you through in summary fashion in a moment. There have been some rays of sunshine alleviating the gloom, notably the very successful first stage of the Iran negotiations, about which I'll say more in a moment, and of course the emerging new international movement focusing on the horrific humanitarian consequences and impact of any use of nuclear weapons. There's also, I guess, been a little bit of sunshine in the modest series of achievements on the nuclear security front, about again, which I'll say some more. But beyond that, overwhelmingly, the story has been one of paralysis, it's been one of minimal forward movement, and it's been one of significant backsliding. To me, I think the most worrying general development has been the significant re-emergence of old Cold War mindsets, old Cold War thinking, reflex thinking about the deterrent utility of nuclear weapons in an environment where people have been made very uncomfortable by assertive Russian behavior, less assertive but nonetheless still assertive Chinese behavior, the continued erratic behavior, I guess, of the North Koreans. You've got this extraordinarily visible urge among policymakers not to address in any way, intellectually or rationally, the substance of the arguments against the continuing efficacy of nuclear deterrence, but just the comfort blanket argument. Psychologically, it's an unhappy, stressful, troubling environment. Let's go back reflexively to reliance on nuclear weapons. And associated with that has been an even greater unwillingness to accept the reality that whatever residual deterrent utility they might have, and that's hugely questionable, nonetheless, the risks associated with any retention of any nuclear weapons by anyone far outweigh any possible advantage. The point that was made so effectively by those hard-headed Cold War realists, Kissinger, Schultz, Nunn and Perry in their 2007 Wall Street op-eds, which also, of course, fed into that initial spirit of optimism. There may not be a very gigantic risk of deliberate use of nuclear weapons, or at least first use, by anyone. But of course we now know from the consistent new revelations that are emerging almost monthly about close calls during the Cold War years, and all that we now know about quite inadequate command and control systems as between some of the new nuclear players and the subcontinent in particular. What we now know about the potential for cyber sabotage, brand new technological developments adding a whole new element of risk of misadventure, miscommunication, miscalculation. It's a very dangerous situation indeed. As I and my colleagues have constantly said, it's not a matter of good judgment, it's not a matter of statesmanship that we've managed to survive since 1945 without a nuclear weapons catastrophe. It's been a matter of sheer dumb luck. But that's the background against which this report has been written, the background against which it was launched last month in Geneva and Vienna, and in which I've been engaged in the last 2 or 3 weeks in launching it as well in Tokyo, in Seoul, in Beijing, and Moscow, and other capitals. So here we are. The shape of the report has been briefly outlined by Warren in his introduction. The 300 pages, basically, the first 3/4 of it is quite a detailed analysis, topic by topic, and hopefully in a reasonably rational sequence of the 4 big issues of disarmament, non-proliferation, nuclear security, and peaceful uses. The last little bit of the report, less than a quarter of it, is this lays out the detailed recommendations, first of all, of the NPT review conference in 2010, then the recommendations or outcomes of the 3 nuclear security summits in 10, 12 and 14, and it also lays out the rather more ambitious benchmarks set by the 2009 International Commission report. It evaluates progress or lack of it on each one of those action items or recommendations using a sort of traffic light colour code, red for no movement at all the way up to green for complete implementation. And you'll see cross-references there, paragraph by paragraph, back to the main text. So if you want to know the rationale for the judgment that's being made, it's easy to find it in the main text. And we've also added an index which hopefully will make life a little easier for those who want to use this as a reference document. Hopefully it will be, as was the first report in the series, a useful reference document then for the 2014 PrepCom, now, sorry, the 2013 PrepCom, now for the 2015 conference itself. We also hope that the report will have some utility as an advocacy tool for policymakers and more particularly research institutes and civil society activist organisations that are trying to keep the flag flying and the flame alive in this very difficult area. For those of you who were familiar with the first report edition of this 2 years ago, it's about 30% of new material, quite apart from the updating of all the specific figures. That new material is mainly about ballistic missile defence, about weapons in space. There's also a much expanded treatment, as you'd expect, of the humanitarian impact movement and discussion, for example, of various options for some treaty-focused civil society campaigning. The report was written by the team at the Australian National University, supported by CIPRI, who we employed as consultants because of their credibility and stature when it comes to detailed analysis of who possesses what and so on in terms of the nitty-gritty, the weeds of arms control. So against all that background, let's get to the 4 main subject areas. Let me quickly describe what our conclusions have been. So far as the disarmament story is concerned, for a start, on the key question of disarmament objectives and strategy, how serious are the nuclear armed states about any movement at all towards a nuclear weapons-free world? The answer is they're not serious at all, and therefore you have to give them a red mark for absolutely no progress. None of the nuclear armed states is committed to any specific timetable for the minimisation, let alone abolition, of its nuclear stockpiles. And on the evidence of the size of their arsenals, what's happening to them, their fissile materials stocks, their force modernisation plans, their stated doctrine and their known deployment practices, we have to conclude that every single one of them, all of the 5 states under the NPT and the other 4 outside it, India, Pakistan, Israel and North Korea, all of them foresee indefinite retention of nuclear weapons and a continuing role for them in their security policies. The steam has gone out of the bilateral process that matters most between the United States and Russia, possessing between them some 95% still of the world's stockpile, and interest anywhere among nuclear-armed states in multilateral disarmament processes is also demonstrably negligible, I have to report. In terms of disarmament principles, by which we mean essentially irreversibility, transparency and verification as spelt out in NPT 2010 Action 2, there's been some continuing effort and renewed effort on the verification front. UK, Norway, now the United States getting into the act and mobilizing quite a substantial research effort in this respect. But on the irreversibility issue, I don't think anything's happened to give us any confidence that dismantlement or other decisions will indeed be, if they're ever made, will in fact be non-reversible. And on the subject of transparency, I have to say the story is not really very good at all, notwithstanding the orgy of enthusiasm with which the P5 have announced their adoption of a new report for producing detailed information about what they're doing with their numbers and their doctrine. The truth of the matter is, when you look carefully at what they are actually telling us, there's practically nothing that's new. And in this very useful little chart, which you probably can't read from the back, which was just not in our volume because it was only published about 3 weeks ago by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, you've got there an assessment, basically, United States, Russia, Britain, France, China, against number of warheads down through fissile material stockpiles and so on. I won't go through it in detail, but you'll see that although there is some transparency of a useful kind, particularly from the US, from Britain and France, on numbers and deployment, not much at all from Russia and China. Of course, when you go to the other nuclear-armed states outside the NPT, completely zero transparency on all these fronts. So we're not really making much progress there, and I think that has to be recognised. The numbers issue, to come back to that now, nuclear arms reductions, we say there's been a little bit, you have to say there's been some progress on the transparency issue, and certainly some on the verification, but where it matters most, it hasn't been happening. And that's also true with nuclear arms reductions. You know the basic story in this respect from our table, taking into account those stockpile of weapons that are notionally to be dismantled. The current global total at the moment is around 16,400, again with the overwhelming preponderance in the hands of Russia and the United States. The worst news in this particular table is that and you don't see it because this is just a snapshot as at the end of 2014, but in terms of actual movement over time, we are seeing increases in the 4 Asian states in the stockpiles, admittedly against a small base, but India, Pakistan, China and DPRK are all in the business of increasing their arsenals, not reducing them. This is the overall story from 45 through to 2013. The difference in the figure down here, you saw 16,000 a minute ago, now it's 10,000. That's simply because this table only looks at deployed weapons or weapons in reserve and takes out those that are notionally scheduled for dismantlement. But the basic storyline in this table is that, yes, of course, there's been dramatic progress in reduction when you look at it, the numbers as against the height of the Cold War in the mid-80s, up around 65,000 weapons deployed and in reserve, down to a global total of 10 defined that way now. But the trouble is the momentum which we thought was building to take this whole process significantly further has really pretty comprehensively stalled. The New START process has, of course, been significant in reducing the number of deployed strategic warheads, not non-deployed and not sub-strategic warheads, but deployed strategic warheads as between Russia and the United States. And cooperation is still continuing between those two, which is good since there's not much visible cooperation on anything else at the moment. And by 2018, accordingly, we can expect those numbers to come down to around 1,500, 1,550 each of deployed strategic warheads. But there's no obligation to dismantle those weapons, so taken out of deployment. And the unhappy consequence of the signing and ratification of the New START Treaty was that there's been a huge surge of commitment to modernisation of the weapons stockpiles that exist, certainly in the United States, with that well-publicised figure of $355 billion expected to be spent over the next decade, up to $1 trillion on some estimates over the next 30 years, and in Russia as well. Sam Nunn, I think, put it pretty well in this respect in a recent statement, saying that the President's vision was terrific, was a significant change in direction in 2009, but the process of implementing that vision so far has done nothing more than preserve the status quo, and I'm afraid that's pretty much the case so far as numbers are concerned. The United Kingdom has delivered ahead of time in its stated intention to reduce the number of deployed weapons now down to 120, which we hadn't picked up because this is as of December and that was announced subsequently. But that's about the end of the good news story because elsewhere the numbers are increasing. In terms of nuclear, the next thing on my list is nuclear doctrine, which is to do with the role, the salience, the articulated rationale for nuclear weapons in national security policy. Here we had back in 2009, in the context of the US Nuclear Posture Review, some really quite optimistic signs from the United States that it wanted to move quite significantly in the direction of reducing the salience of nuclear weapons. Not quite so far as to fully embrace a no first use posture, but certainly willingness to embrace, in the case of the President, the concept that the sole purpose, a declaratory position that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons was to halt the threat or react to the threat of the use of nuclear weapons by others. In other words, that nuclear weapons weren't to deal at all with non-nuclear threat contingencies. Unhappily, in reaction to the mounting volatility of the situations in East Asia and in Europe, the US allies in both those regions demonstrated a total lack of enthusiasm for any such reduction in the role of nuclear weapons. And if anything, the situation has... so the US didn't feel able to go that far in 2010 with the posture review, and since then the situation's only got worse so far as doctrine is concerned. In terms of nuclear force posture, by which we mean essentially the physical deployment of weapons and their launch alert status, here, apart from New START, which has reduced the deployment, as I've just said, of strategic nuclear weapons, there's frankly no sign of reduced deployment by anyone in any category. No reduction in tactical weapons, sub-strategic weapons in Europe, although much argument about the desirability of doing so now, going back over many years. Certainly no reduction on the part of the Russians in respect of their stockpiles in this respect. Certainly talk of deployment of battlefield nuclear weapons by Pakistan, which is particularly troubling. And another development, particularly in Asia, a very significant move towards sea-based deployment of nuclear weapons on submarines, in the case of China, India, and quite probably soon Pakistan. There is an argument, of course, that sea-based deployments, submarine deployments, have a stabilising rather than destabilising role, in the sense that with guaranteed survivability, or pretty much guaranteed survivability, certainly by comparison to static land-based missiles, you are contributing to nuclear stability because you give states the confidence they can deal with any attack upon them. But while you're getting to that sort of position, I think the overall impact of such deployments tend to be destabilising rather than stabilising, and there's certainly concern about that development. In the case of parallel security issues, by essentially ballistic missile defence. We mean new conventional capability, in particular the US enthusiasm for developing these intercontinental ballistic missiles with very, very high level precision capability armed with conventional warheads. But nonetheless troubling, or saying that it's troubling to these states, Russia and China, because their belief that this is destabilising, this reduces their capacity to keep a survivable retaliatory capability. So you've got anxiety over conventional imbalances generally, but the further development of this new capability in particular. And you've got, here it is, and you've got certainly huge amount of anxiety, some of it a little feigned, but a lot of it real, from Russia and China about the US determination to plunge ahead with ballistic missile defence in all its various manifestations. And the US explanation that these systems are really just designed to deal with rogue states, potential rogue states like North Korea and Iran, isn't really cutting too much mustard with either Russia or China, who both believe, or say they believe, that these systems as currently configured certainly have a dual use capability of application to them. There's also concerns about weaponisation of space, with no visible movement anywhere in terms of introducing protocols and regimes here that might alleviate those concerns. So that brings us to the last subject area, mobilising political will. How well are we doing here in terms of this aspect of the disarmament agenda? Well, the short answer, I'm afraid, is not very well at all, with the exception of the emergence of this humanitarian impact movement, which is generating quite a lot of traction and momentum among middle power states and the non-weapon states and the non-US allies and partners, at least, only a handful of exceptions, worldwide. So you are getting, with the succession of conferences initiated by the Swiss, first of all, with the Norwegians, the Oslo conference, then the NAIRIT conference in Mexico, then the most recent one in Vienna, hosted by the Austrians. You are seeing what on the face of it is a quite exciting new development, and the civil society, of course, is also very attached to this, as it should be, because it's the first hope for some time that there's something new going on out there which will, in fact, be a little bit of a game changer in terms of the political environment. But all that said, it's very hard so far to see this as having any particular traction that's likely to feed through in any certainly short to medium term way in the actual behaviour of the nuclear armed states or those sailing with them. You've got all sorts of resistance there to even attending these conferences so far as the weapon states are concerned. We had the United States and UK finally turning up in Vienna, which is a good thing, but certainly no willingness to sign any of the statements emerging from this. And very hard now, although there's a lot of debate going on about this with the New Agenda Coalition and others suggesting strategic ways forward with development of strategies to get some normative convention momentum going, as with the Ottawa and Oslo conventions on landmines and cluster bombs, not with a view to getting any kind of immediate buy-in by the weapon states, but at least creating a normative pressure, a moral pressure upon them. You've got this sort of stuff going on, but you'd have to be a bit of an optimist to see any of this translating into any kind of change of mindset or actual change of policy in the case of the weapons players and their allies and partners, which matters most at the moment. And that's also the case, I have to say. Other judgments about this may differ, but for all the heroic efforts of Global Zero and ICANN and others in the civil society movement, many of whom are represented here, it's very hard to see that this stuff is really gaining a very big toehold in terms of popular sentiment in any of our countries. And as a politician, for 21 years as I was, I mean, it just is the case that unless policymakers sense that there's some kind of pressure coming at them from below to do something in these areas, they're never going to be very inclined to treat anything like this as a priority. So a lot of work to be done shortly on all of that stuff. Minimal progress is the answer. Moving quickly to the non-proliferation story, and I'll try and be quicker about all the rest of it because disarmament to me is always the main game. Largely because of the perceived intransigence of the weapon states on the disarmament front and any kind of serious attention to Article 6 obligations. There's been very little movement over the last 5 years when it comes to significantly strengthening the non-proliferation regime. And I'm afraid that very little new momentum can be expected at the forthcoming NPT RevCon in a few days' time in this respect. We all know that it's not an especially rational response for the non-weapon states to say that because of their anger at the weapon states for not doing enough to make the world nuclear weapon free, we're not going to do anything either to create a stronger regime to inhibit that possibility. But here as elsewhere, it's psychology that tends to matter in international relations, and the psychological environment, frankly, for significant new regime strengthening in the non-proliferation area. That atmosphere is really not there. But let's go quickly through it. In terms of safeguards and verification, yes, there is a bit of a good news story in the sense that progress has been made and more states signing up to the additional protocol and and moving towards the universalisation of stronger safeguards. But even here, you've still got some holdouts of states with really quite significant civil nuclear capability. Argentina, Brazil, Egypt, Venezuela, Syria, of course, are not helping at all in terms of showing any signs of changing their approach to movement here. And as well as states outside the NPT, Israel, Pakistan and DPRK are just not wanting to get into any kind of discussion with the IAEA at all on improved safeguards. But on compliance and enforcement, the traditional issue here at the NPT conference, as you'll know, is can there be agreement reached on strengthening the sanctions mechanism, the disciplines associated with any state that walks away or purports to walk away from the NPT, with North Korea being the classic case in point. And here I have to say that there's, for all the continued anxiety about North Korea and, of course, the anxiety about Iran, that none of that seems to have translated, so far as I can tell, into any greater enthusiasm than there's ever been for strengthening those withdrawal mechanisms, notwithstanding the constant drum beating by the weapon states in that respect. On the actual physical situations in North Korea, it's one step forward, two steps back, two steps forward, one step back. This goes on and on and on, and there only seems to be, one realistic approach to adopt to this at the moment, and that's what it has been for a while, a combination of containment, deterrence, and keeping the door open for negotiations. I remain something of an optimist that it's not completely impossible in the longer term to get the North Koreans to walk back from where they are, but getting all those ducks in line and getting the right mindset simultaneously from the Japanese and the Americans and the South Koreans is not easy. The Iran story is, of course, so far anyway, a very good news story, and we ought to take a second, I think, to acknowledge that. In short, I mean, what is not to like? What is not to like about an initial agreement which, in outline, is intended to deliver a complete end to any plutonium path to a bomb, which will deliver, if implemented, very significant limitations, very significant inbuilt delays into any enriched uranium path to a bomb, which does have associated with it an extremely intrusive international monitoring and verification regime going further than the additional protocol, and which, with the combination of areas of agreement or potential agreement here, will in fact ensure an extension of the present breakout time, that is the time to acquire sufficient fissile material of weapons grade to make at least one bomb. There is sufficient capacity to move to, we are talking about an extension of that from present 2 to 3 months to a year or more. So what's not to like about any of that? Particularly when the only alternatives that any of the critics have been able to offer have been manifestly deeply unpersuasive. There's really only two that are on the table. One is continuation of the sanctions regime, and arguably, so far as some of the critics are concerned, a strengthening of that regime. But with no likely result from any such enterprise other than Iran's nuclear progress proceeding substantially unhindered. I was very much around running International Crisis Group in some of the earlier negotiations and argument with Iran about how we might turn the situation around in the early 2000s, and frankly a deal was doable then had the West been less dogmatic about insisting on zero enrichment capability and prepared to settle on something like the parameters of the present regime, delayed limited enrichment. But in the process of that inability to consummate anything then, another decade has gone by and we've moved from less than 200 centrifuges to 19,000 to now deal with. And frankly, that I think would be the reality of any attempt simply to go back to a sanctions squeeze approach. And as to the alternative, the other approach of military action, this is almost universally acknowledged by anyone who understands the military options available here, is not likely to delay any nuclear program by more than 3 years or so, and is certain to unleash a storm of retaliatory action by Iran in the region and beyond, as well as making totally implausible any possibility of a larger normalisation and stabilisation of relations in the Middle East. Moving to export controls here, a little bit of a good news story in the sense that a number of countries are making greater use of multilateral guidelines and developing national export controls. And you've also got informal mechanisms like the PSI, Proliferation Security Initiative, with over 100 countries now participating, certainly helping to make illicit transfers harder. But against this, the crucial nuclear suppliers group mechanism has had quite significantly diminished credibility since the decision not so long ago to exempt India from the restrictions that previously inhibited any effective dealings with it at all on nuclear technology or material. And now also with China's apparent determination to supply new reactors to Pakistan outside the framework of the NSG, that's not helping its credibility either. And the subject of nuclear weapons-free zones, a little bit of good news in the sense of the Central Asian protocols, of all Central Asian zone protocols have been signed by the nuclear weapons states. But elsewhere, Southeast Asia still limps along with nobody able to agree on those ratifications there. And of course, the critical issue of the Middle East, proposed Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone. Despite all the hopes invested into generating some new momentum in that area at the 2010 review conference, and despite a huge amount of effort by the Finnish negotiators, mediators, a lot of other players, we've got absolutely nothing, frankly, to show for that. The only marginally better news that I can report after talking about all this in recent weeks in Geneva and Vienna and elsewhere is that I don't sense that the Egyptians and others who have made such a huge issue of this in the past are really all that keen on blowing up the 2015 review conference on this issue. There's a variety of reasons for that, linked with what's happened internally in Egypt in recent years, linked also with the fact that I guess the RevCon is being chaired by Algerian lady this time round, so there's a bit of Middle Eastern pride involved in the success of the conference. But more particularly, I think just a sense which I'll come back to before I finish about the larger state of play and the inutility of having too big a row about this sort of issue when so much of the whole nuclear agenda is looking so fragile at the moment. So, but certainly no good news, and of course no good news at all on nuclear testing with the CTBT. Despite President Obama's efforts, absolutely no closer to ratification than has been the case in the past. And with China and India, despite many blandishments from me and lots of others to jump ahead of the United States, so far not willing to do that. And of course, with the fissile material treaty negotiations completely stuck, as they have been for years now, in the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. The primary obstacle being Pakistan's unwillingness to give any kind of imprimatur to the negotiations even beginning, denying consensus for that. But frankly, with at least a couple of the other major players, and China and India are not very far away from the action in this respect, being all too comfortable with that, that little blockage operation that's going on. So we move from there. If you look at, on disarmament, I should have just quickly summarised where we're at in terms of the report in front of you by saying against the 29 specific recommendations in the NPT 2010 outcome, that's in pie chart terms the result, with most of it being a sea of minimal progress or no progress red, against the rather higher bars that were set by the International Commission report in 2009, you get even more red and orange. Again, in the context of non-proliferation, just to summarise it, against the NPT 2010 outcomes, a lot of yellow meaning some progress and quite a bit of 8 meaning substantial progress. But frankly, they weren't terribly high, the bars that were set in 2010. And when you argue, as we did in the Commission in 2009, for a much tougher non-proliferation regime to be implemented and recommend accordingly, then you get a real sea of red and orange, as you can see. So moving to nuclear security, this is a long story if you go through it in detail, but I'll keep it short by saying this. There have been some modest gains from the 3 nuclear security summits in Washington, Seoul and The Hague in generating certainly a degree of consensus that something needs to be done to ensure that nuclear weapons and fissile material don't fall into the wrong hands. And certainly there's been some significant achievement at the national level, blue for significant progress, on national nuclear security regulations, particularly stimulated by UN Resolution 1540. But while the summits have generated a sort of flurry of activity on what unquestionably has been a badly neglected area in the past, there is a sense internationally that a lot of this is really pretty hollow at the core. One way in which it's hollow, I think, is the sense that if only all that high-level summatory effort had been devoted to actual disarmament, to actual strengthening a non-proliferation regime, rather than just to the rather limited area of locking up potentially loose material, then maybe we'd be further advanced on all those other critical fronts. But even taking the summits absolutely on their own terms, which one probably should, I think there is a sense that the process, even after 3 successive summits and all the preparatory effort that's gone into it, there is a sense that there are real weaknesses still to be addressed here, which may not be overcome by the time of the final summit in the sequence in Chicago in 2016. In particular, none of the new or expanded instruments do address sensitive nuclear materials, highly enriched uranium or plutonium, in the hands of military. 85% of the world's sensitive fissile materials under military rather than civilian control, and that just has not been dealt with at all in the summits so far. There's much more that needs to be done in setting overarching international standards rather than just domestic ones. To the extent that international standards or obligations are created, there's nothing much, or national ones too, there's nothing much in the way of commitments for international accountability. And international cooperation on a number of fronts is looking increasingly fragile, with the winding up in particular of the US-Russian cooperation, which was so productive for so many years on the megatons to megawatts Nunn-Lugar project, and with Russia showing no signs of enthusiasm for further participating in the summit process. It's not great. So when you look at the nuclear security summit commitments, on the face of it, a better news story, lots of significant progress, some progress, but when read against the limitations of the scope of those summit deliberations, I think you can see that the grounds for pessimism still continue. Moving to, finally, and again very quickly, to peaceful uses, the third and remaining pillar of the NPT, nuclear power, nuclear, industrial and medical applications. This area is in really pretty good shape so far as the general international cooperation and the supportive role of the IAEA is concerned. Prospects for future expansion of civil nuclear energy, for those who don't get too upset about the nature and the legitimacy of this. It's quite a good news story in the sense that notwithstanding so many Europeans being spooked by the Fukushima experience, there's quite a considerable commitment to planning and constructing new power reactors. What is a less good news story, I think, is in the area of safety and security commitments, where notwithstanding all the post-Fukushima soul-searching, international standards, international transparency, international accountability are all really lacking in that security-safety interface, and a lot more work needs to be done. And so far as mitigating proliferation risks are concerned, a little bit of good news in the sense that there's widespread agreement now and a lot of action towards minimising or eliminating the use of highly enriched uranium in research reactors. But progress on multilateral fuel banks to act as a substitute for domestic fissile material production and to discourage that production by new entrants into the civil nuclear process, really progress on those multilateral fuel banks has been very minimal. And similarly with proliferation-resistant technology, a lot of talk about that, but very little further development, very little take-up of that. So moving to the peaceful uses, the story is pretty much the same. Doesn't look too bad at all by comparison, by looking at what's happened under the NPT, but not quite so flash when you raise the benchmarks a little higher, as we did in the 2009 report. So just to conclude with 3 or 4 remaining sentences, overall we have moved from the fading optimism of our first report card to really a situation of outright pessimism. We do seem to be back in pre-2009 sleepwalker mode with, such in the areas that some progress, yes, in security and peaceful uses, but in the areas that matters most, and this is again against the benchmarks of the International Commission report, in the areas that matter most, recommendations on actual serious movement, not just talk about nuclear disarmament, actual movement towards strengthening the nuclear non-proliferation regime, lots of no progress and minimal progress. None of this, on the face of it, is good news leading up to this year's 2015 RevCon, because so far from getting a lot of positive reports of movement on the various action plan items from 2010, so far from being able to use those positive reports as a foundation for new target setting, new commitments, we will be, I suspect, back in the realm of thinking that 2015 is a success, simply if it doesn't collapse in ignominious failure, an obvious failure like 2005. That's not really where any of us want to be. The only remaining little glimmer of optimism I can give you, and this is my very last word, is that talking about all this and presenting this report as I have now to a number of different audiences and continents all around the world, the story overall is so depressing, so gloomy, that the reaction of a lot of the policymakers I've talked to, the people who will be coming to the conference here in the next few days, is one not so much of throwing up their hands completely by saying, for God's sake, we can't let things get worse. We are going to have to work like hell, not just to advance our familiar national agendas and storytelling. We are going to have to work like hell this year to ensure that we do make 2015 at least not a further step backwards. But whether that optimism has any grounds for justification at all, we'll hear from Angela, I guess. So thank you for listening, and we'll take it from there.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Gareth, and thank you, Warren. And when you come to be a discussant for someone like Gareth Evans, I think it's a pretty daunting task. First of all, when you're a discussant, you always try to find a loophole. What did they do wrong? Or where did they find, what can you criticize and find fault with? And unfortunately, with Gareth not only being so lucid and very well presenting his arguments, it's all fact-based. So obviously, I can only agree with a lot of what he said. But let me just recall what he said, and that is really very important, is as we go into this NPT review conference next week, he talked about paralysis, minimal forward movement, he talked about backsliding, and he talked about a Cold War mindset. And I think all of us who attend these meetings on a regular basis and with increasing frequency over the last couple of months could only agree with that is in fact what we are facing. Now, the good news of that is, as he said, is we're all now so scared that it can be a failure that hopefully it won't be, but everyone will work extremely hard in terms of making it. And I want to thank IPI for organizing this, and Warren, you too. And I commented to someone I talked to in the beginning, and I said, look, last time we had this report, as Gareth also mentioned, 2 years ago, we had this presentation of the report, and we really didn't have a lot of people signing up. And we thought, oh goodness, what did we do? There's very little interest in these issues. At that time, at least there was. So I'm very happy that all of you came and you're interested, and I hope you have lots of questions. Now, we do have a sober situation that we're facing. And we do have an increasingly dismal international climate. I think we are all aware of that. And I don't want to go through this, but on the other hand, we have a stalling in the path to a nuclear-free world. And we are now at the 45-year mark of the existence of the NPT. In 5 years, we will have 50 years, half a century of a 3-pillar treaty, and one of them, as we have heard, is of course the nuclear disarmament, and he has already demonstrated what has happened there. Now, there are certain questions I want to pose. And those questions are really, how do we reverse this negative trend? And how do we ensure that the NPT retains its place as a load-bearing pillar of our collective security? And how do we return to plotting a course for a world free of nuclear weapons? And actually, how do we safeguard a successful conclusion to the review conference? And that is really my foremost goal. There have been a lot of expectations. It'll be a bad review conference because of the current political climate, because nothing much has happened. You've seen the scorecard. So how can we actually do this? To my mind, this inbuilt pessimism is really a terrible idea. I think what we must do really is focus on the fact, how do we actually go forward to this? How do we actually make it so that it retains credibility? And let me also recall that this year is probably the last review conference that any of the Hibakushas who survived the atomic bombing 7 years ago are still alive. Most of them are high in their 80s. I think you can look at the numbers, you can look at the ages. So a number of them are coming to this review conference, and I think they serve as a very sobering reminder of what can happen when you do have a nuclear explosion. And I think, Gareth, you already said that it was just sheer dumb luck that nothing ever happened in the meantime, and that we didn't have a nuclear explosion, even accidental one. Now, I think that the first step that we need to have a good NPT review conference, if I can call it that, is that all states parties need to affirm their national interests are best served by faithfully implementing and remaining in strict compliance with the treaty's mutually reinforcing pillars. And I also think that the member states must confirm and must remember that the NPT is a bargain, and progress on disarmament non-proliferation is symbiotic because one simply is not going to move without the other. And when you look at the non-nuclear weapon states and then reading this report, as extensive and as exhaustive as it is, they will take it as further evidence that the nuclear weapon states are really not adhering to their side of the bargain, because it's in the first pillar, the nuclear disarmament one, that there's very little that actually has happened. And there are, as Gareth mentioned, a large number of states, about 3/4 of the NPT adherents, who have signed the safeguards agreement, the additional protocols. But on the other hand, many non-nuclear weapon states do not recognize, and that's really the underlying premise, they do not recognize the need for strengthened verification standards without commensurate moves on disarmament, on nuclear disarmament. And that's something that is really very, very important in the dialogue. And I'm also reminded that when you look at the four nuclear weapon states that are not parties to the NPT, that have not acceded to them, you really want a treaty to be attractive to states joining them. I'm not sure that that is an attractive treaty for states to join, particularly now that there are already certain cave-outs being made, for example, on India, on, as you mentioned, on the nuclear suppliers group. And I think that that is extremely important, that there has to be more of an attempt made, in my opinion, on the part of the nuclear weapon states to entice those who have who are outside the treaty but who do have nuclear weapons to join the treaty. And I don't see those efforts, at least they're not visible to the ones like me working in this. Now, the third step that the review conference should take is really to reach consensus on the way to 2020. That's the 50th anniversary. As I mentioned, it's an extremely important date. What are we going to have to show for at the 2020 conference? And that really means implementation on the action plan, but particularly in the first 22 of them, which are the ones on nuclear disarmament, those are the ones that are extremely important. And there are other measures that are complementary to this: comprehensive test ban treaty, fissile material, you already mentioned them. But on the other hand, if the nuclear weapon states do address, because those are only the actions that they can take in the first part, the 22 first actions, that they have the obligation to follow through on it. If they can demonstrate that there's actually a will to go forward, I think then there is a certain credibility that remains to them. What is not very helpful is if now there's a reinterpretation of what happened at the 2010 conference. I will share with you, I was not there, but everyone I talked to and everyone I've heard speak about it who was there says this was not intended to be an indefinite plan, not something that was going to be done in 20 years or maybe that was going to be done in 30 years. There's a definite expectation that this would be implemented. And so therefore, that's another good faith a demonstration that should be made by the part of the nuclear weapon states. Did everyone expect that it would be implemented in 5 years? I think it was very ambitious. It was recognized. But on the other hand, I think that there was not an expectation that now it's suddenly morphed into an open-ended plan that would just kind of take a long time to implement. And I think there's a lot of impatience on the part of the non-nuclear weapon states to see that. I appreciate, Gareth, you talking also about the humanitarian consequences. And I have to look exactly what you said, because you said you didn't really think it was a game changer. I think that it, maybe I misinterpreted. Yeah. But on the other hand, I do think it has injected a tremendous energy into the conference discussion. What is not good is I don't think it should derail the NPT, because it really is something that is next to the NPT, if I can call it that. Yes, it's part of the discussion, but on the other hand, it shouldn't really derail the NPT by having too much discussion on the humanitarian consequences. But I must also say that the Austrian pledge, which the Austrians have, I think, put forward to member states to endorse, has by now, if I understand correctly, about 60 states adhering to it. And that's pretty powerful, because the Austrian pledge is very strong in the way that it puts itself forward. But I think that we have to recognize that why has this arisen? Also the legal case by the Marshall Islands, for example, humanitarian consequences, that has arisen simply because there's so much frustration about the non-forward movement of anything to do with nuclear disarmament. And I think that has to be recognized by all of us. And yes, there have been other measures, and you mentioned the Nuclear Security Summit. And let me tell you, I mean, this has been a very intense effort. I mean, I attended countless Sherpa meetings and papers to be looked at and what have you. But what a lot of people outside, those who are not working in disarmament, don't know, that what we're talking about, the non-proliferation in that particular area, is 15% of all stocks. Because all of it that is defense is basically excluded from it. It's only the civil material. And I think that is kind of a little bit of not a very, it's an open secret among those of us who work on this, but it doesn't really make it for very encouraging news. And of course, it doesn't have universal membership either. And maybe it doesn't need to, but Russia has right now, or a couple of months ago, decided that it's not going to participate. Again, not a very good sign in terms of future cooperation on this issue. The political framework for the comprehensive agreement on Iran, I think, is very hopeful. I think that we hope that it will be concluded. Of course, it's only going to be known by the end of June, unless there's a little bit of an extension. We don't really know it. But on the other hand, I also wonder if it doesn't give pause to those who are outside the treaty right now, whether they should really join. Again, it's something that one needs to look at very carefully in terms of how actually have we ended up in this situation and what it is. But my hope is that we will have an agreement. And I know there's been a tremendous amount of work put in by all sides. I mean, there's 6 states here that basically are negotiating with Iran. And I hope that all of this work is going to end up in an agreement that will support the non-proliferation agenda rather than detract from it. Now, the Middle East zone, again, you have said there's been very little progress. And there has been little progress because it hasn't been held. But it hasn't been for lack of trying on the part of the facilitator and the co-conveners, of which the UN is one, to see what can actually be done. It's the first time in, I think, 20 years since the ACRS process between Israel and Egypt and other Arab states, that they've actually sat together at a table and talk. It's extremely difficult to have a League of Arab States membership and one country, Israel, sitting around the table together and discussing issues that are of very high security importance to all of them. And we have suggested, the facilitator has suggested a number of meetings again. I think we are not yet at the point where we can say we will have the conference. I think it was extremely, I don't know whether I should call it optimistic, whether I should call it foolhardy to decide in 2010 that this conference would be held in 2012. I mean, that's a very short timeline. And there are various electoral calendars also intervening in the process. So it was a very difficult decision to postpone it, if we can call that postponement, and we still haven't had it. But on the other hand, we are having a lot of good conversations, and we're hoping to have more of them. But I do agree with you that the Arab states, I think, will not make this the central piece, or Egypt will not make this the central piece, and somehow disturb the conference as it is. Now, that is really what I want to do. I know that we have very little time left for questioning, so I'm going to give over the podium and give it over to Warren, and he will handle it. Thank you.
I'd love to get some questions now and comments. If I just ask you to raise your hand and wait for the microphone, and please identify yourself. And if I get 2 or 3 hands, I'll take them all at once. Okay, the ambassador first, Reba second, and do I have a third? Third there, okay? And then listen to all 3 questions, if you will, and then we'll answer them all again.
Thank you very much, Gareth, for that typically magisterial presentation. I worked with Gareth for many years as Foreign Minister, and his intellect... Is it on? Apologies. My name's Gillian Bird. I'm Australia's ambassador to the UN, and I was just thanking Gareth for his typically magisterial presentation of this, and thank you very much for the work you've done in the report, which is, I think, a really good resource document. And Angela, thank you very much also for your comments and the work that you've done. The report, Gareth, and your presentation is it's a very sober and sobering account of the state of play, and you're fairly pessimistic in the report, and I think in your presentation, about the prospects for a successful review conference next week. And given the importance, I think, for all of us of a successful outcome, because it's so important that the NPT is strengthened rather than weakened, I would be interested in your views, and maybe Angela's. You're pessimistic because of the lack of progress on the disarmament side, obviously, of the 3 pillars. As a former long-running foreign minister, you know about the art of the possible. I mean, you've always been good at pushing the envelope, but at the end of the day, there are political realities. I'd be interested in your views on what are the couple of things on the disarmament side that you think are realistically achievable, that could be done in the context of the NPT RevCon. A couple of steps that really might help ensure a successful outcome of the RevCon process in the next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Keep those thoughts in mind. Number 2.
I'm Roma Stibrovi, President of NGO Sustainability. Today, as we know, is World Environment Day and Earth Day. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
And I haven't heard any consideration of nuclear weapons as it concerns the environment. And I think it's an important issue to include in any of your thoughts and discussions. Thank you.
Excellent. And the gentleman right behind you, Roma.
Hi, my name is Matthew Carpenter. I'm a reporter for Yomiuri Shimbun, a Japanese newspaper. I have a question for Mr. Evans. I want to play the devil's advocate here. You said that there are traditional security threats, such as bad command and control and terrorism, obviously, and also new ones, such as cyber hijacking. So given to counter these security threats, is putting money into modernizing nuclear infrastructure necessarily entirely a bad thing? What do you think about that?
All right. Gareth, you want to take on those 3?
Well, in terms of what can be done at the NPT Review Conference itself to move the disarmament agenda along, I mean, it really is a matter of trying to find language which will actually prod and be productive rather than counterproductive with the weapon states. I think the most productive areas to focus on are issues of doctrine, issues of deployment, and of course numbers. And what we argued for in the 2009 Commission report, which irritated some people in civil society and some more adventurous governments because we didn't hang our hat on a target date for getting to zero. What we did hang our hat on was a target date, then 2025, for what we called the minimisation agenda, which was not getting to zero so far as numbers were concerned, but to getting down from the existing 16,000, 17,000 plus to no more than 2,000 weapons in total by 2025, getting to a position of universal embrace of a no first use doctrine, and getting to dramatically reduced deployments of those weapons, which would give confidence that the doctrinal changes weren't just words. And when we talk about deployment, we were talking particularly about just the physical numbers that are out there able to be used with minimum additional preparation. But we're also talking about alert status. I should have said something about alert status in my presentation because I think that's one of the areas in which there's been no progress whatsoever. But on the face of it, ought to be the easiest to achieve and would be quite symbolically significant. What's the case at the moment of all those weapons in US and Russian control is about 1,000 each are on launch on warning alert status, which means that they're on the use 'em or lose 'em principle, that if there's some warning, hopefully accurate, of incoming missile attack, you have the capacity to immediately launch the weapons in question at just a few minutes' notice, with the objective, of course, of ensuring that those weapons are not knocked out and are in fact used. All of this is part of the sort of insane logic of the Cold War, but it's continued through into the post-Cold War period. And you've got the United States constantly saying that it's willing to take its weapons off alert status, off this launch on warning alert status, if only the Russians would. And the Russians are saying they won't because they think they're increasingly vulnerable to US attack if they do, even though in the real world, even in the present rather fraught environment, nobody thinks that an actual nuclear attack is remotely likely. But so we're living in this insane sort of world of hair trigger alert. And I think there's a capacity to move on that. If only we could get enough international pressure and enough sense on the part of Russian and US policymakers to mutually agree to de-alert, that would be a huge step forward. The other big thing, of course, would be to try and get and put further pressure on states to break through this impasse on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Lassina Zerbo of the organisation is doing a brilliant job in just going on as if the treaty already exists with the verification mechanisms. There's no rationale for not moving on. It's just politically stuck in the Senate. There's no rationale for either India or China, if they believe their own doctrines, for not ratifying anyway. But if we can just focus on those sort of set of issues, I think that would be the most useful way of energising pressure. I argued for that in the prep comms and so on 2-3 years ago. Pick up this minimisation agenda and go for it. But there was a bit of reluctance to be that specific. For God's sake, let's try to be specific. On the other questions, more briefly, that were raised about, well, why don't I leave it to Angela to respond to those. On modernisation, I'm not sure that anything that the modernisation program is doing to the triad of big beefy missiles in silos, big beefy missiles in submarines, and gravity bombs and other things in aircraft, and the huge costs involved in modernising those, whether they will add any net value at all to capacity to deal with real world threats of jihadist terrorism or the other sorts of things you describe, I mean, is really, it's a stretch. It's, you start with Cold War mentality that these things matter and important. Then just operating within that logic, you throw insane amounts of money and do it. You really only did it in order to get the votes for the New START treaty in the US Senate. which would otherwise not have been there without that modernisation program. So I'm afraid that didn't help at all. There was a second question which I missed, but maybe Angela can pick that one up.
Came from Roma. Oh, it's about the environment.
Oh, environment. Well, I mean, yeah. Well, very, very quickly, the humanitarian impact movement focuses as much on the devastating environmental implications of any use of nuclear weapons as it does on the immediate threat to life and limb, making the point that environmental degradation is itself a humanitarian issue. So there is that linkage. So whenever I was using the expression humanitarian, it was very much with that dimension of it built into it, and that's very much to be applauded.
Any thoughts?
I have one thought, and that particularly goes to Gillian Bird's question about what is realistically possible. I mean, I don't know what is realistically possible for any member state. It's not for me to say. But what I think is really important is right now, I think the non-nuclear weapon states need to be given the sense that they're being taken seriously. And I don't mean that really facetiously, but it's just like it's a little bit paternalistic, from the nuclear weapon states to say, well, yes, I mean, we signed on to it 45 years ago, and yes, we haven't really made any much progress. And I think that is really something that I find very, very difficult from what I hear in the multilateral fora and discussions that I attend. And the transparency, I thought it was very useful that you had that in your presentation also, because the transparency, as accurate we think you are, but it really is not confirmed. We had been, as the UN, we had been asked to put up a website to sort of basically where nuclear weapon states could post information on their numbers and deployment, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look at that, it's very, very little populated. There's very little information on there. I mean, it's really rather pathetic. I mean, we put it there, but on the other hand, it really did not yield a lot of transparency and information that could have been put up there. And I think just to have the sense that something is happening in terms of, is there any roadmap? Is there anything that is not like far out in nirvana, and never land somehow, but is there actually something that is achievable beforehand? Would make a huge difference in terms of the non-nuclear weapon states to make them feel that this is worthwhile having signed up to.
All right. Number one. Another hand? We've got, okay, number two over here. And, all right. Number three. Very good.
Thank you very much, Arlette Laurent. You've both mentioned the progress or lack of, or slowness of member states. My question, unfortunately, is there any risk, or what is the risk of non-states entities getting their hand on nuclear weapons, and could that be possibly a leverage on the states, whether members or not? Thank you.
Very good question. John Hirsch?
John Hirsch with IPI. First of all, thank you both very, very much, and also for the work you're both doing. I want to kind of latch on to your point about what's realistic and ask you about Russia and China, which are, of course, two of the P5. And the points you both were sort of making, and Angela in particular was making, was the need for these countries to show some demonstrable commitment themselves to implementing the obligations of the NPT if you're ever going to get the other states to adhere to it. So you've just been in Beijing and Moscow, and of course we're all aware, at least it seems to me, there's a big freeze in U.S.-Russian relations these days. So first of all, is there any prospect, given that freeze, that the Russians will be willing to play any kind of positive role on any of these issues at this conference next week? And secondly, you barely mentioned China, but in every other presentation these days, China is this mega power that's got a lot of influence in the world. So what are the how important is this issue to China? Non-proliferation and disarmament. Are they willing to put some moxie behind that in their presentations in this meeting, or is this sort of very secondary or immaterial to them? So I think that would be great if both of you could comment on that.
Okay. And Jeff Laurenti.
Thank you, Warren, and thank you, Angela and Gareth, for a terrific curtain raiser and presentation for next week's review conference. I wonder if you could walk through each of the nuclear possessing states and tell us, as best as you know, what within their respective militaries is the evolving view on the utility and the relative cost trade-off of the nukes versus their other capabilities? Or is this really driven in those countries by a political class that sees bigger is better? And if you could offer us some thinking as to why, particularly for the US case, why our European allies are so uninterested in trying to push a disarmament agenda, a nuclear disarmament agenda within NATO. What are the Germans, the Italians, others that we sometimes pay attention to, afraid of that they don't stand up on this issue? Is it not important to them?
Gareth, if you would take all three of those, and then Angela can.
Yeah, well, in terms of non-state actors, there is a serious anxiety, of course, about them ever getting access to nuclear material or fully developed weapons. And that's really what UN Security Council 1540 is all about. And when I mentioned that there has been quite a lot of state regulatory activity designed explicitly to provide for better security against those sorts of contingencies, at least so far as, again, civil material is concerned, there's not much attention in anything to the military material. I think we can say that the problem is absolutely acknowledged. An awful lot of people are sort of working on it. And, you know, some visible progress has been made, but it's still a little bit hollow at the core in those areas of accountability and transparency and data and so. But Angela might want to say some more about that. In terms of Russia and China, Russia's the hardest case at the moment. If you look at what Putin's actually been saying in terms of, and senior Russians have recently been saying, I mean, it's really back to the future. I mean, the Cold War language is alive and well. We had these statements being made in the context of the Crimea enterprise that Russia was at least ready to consider putting its nuclear forces on alert in the context of that crisis. We had Putin saying a little bit later had plans to, quote, surprise the West with our developments in offensive nuclear weapons. Well, maybe the surprise was they're going to reduce them, but somehow I don't think so. Somehow I don't think so. We've had Danish, and look, when I was in Moscow and I was talking not only to the think tank community, which is feeling a bit shell-shocked at the moment, but nonetheless very well disposed to this agenda, but I was also talking to a number of senior officials, including those involved in the Iran negotiations, and language, body language, mindset, not encouraging on any front. And in the context of the NPT, well, so what if the NPT doesn't agree on anything? It's purely marginal relevance in the scheme of things. If we get a good agreements, that's fine. If we don't get good agreements, you know, we're not going to be interested in pursuing. So I came away feeling that sense of, you know, a little bit of despair that I think all of us do in dealing with Russian diplomats, people at the moment. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of people with, you know, genuinely positive thinking about these issues, but it's not a recipe for career advancement at the moment to be thinking in a positive and civilized way in Moscow. China's very, very different. I'm much more optimistic about China, and I think China, after all, the numbers, you know, some Russians have been arguing for some time that, you know, there's secret stashes of Chinese weapons buried away in subway tunnels, and there's really 3,000 of them, not 250 or so, as everybody else seems to think. China has, right from the beginning, not staked too much on its nuclear arsenal. It's always operated on the basis of minimal credible deterrence. That's still the articulated justification. It wants to be able to do visible retaliatory damage if it was ever attacked, but it's still strongly committed. And I think not just rhetorically, but genuinely to a no-first-use posture. And it makes a reasonable case of arguing that whatever it's doing is entirely consistent with that general approach of it's got strong negative security assurances to other players, stronger than in the case of the other countries. And unless you take the cynical view that all of this is just, you know, window dressing and none of it's to be taken at face value, and frankly, the Chinese approach to transparency is such that it makes it very difficult to know whether there is reality in these assertions that are being made. Nonetheless, the general atmospherics is better for all the sort of chest beating that's going on in China at the moment, all the Xi Jinping assertiveness in multiple directions, including some rather disconcerting territorial assertiveness in the South China Sea in particular. For all of that, one doesn't sense that they want nuclear weapons to come to centre stage. I think they're genuinely troubled by CPGS, the Conventional Prompt Global Strike, this new conventional capability that US is developing. They're genuinely concerned about ballistic missile defence and the location of these systems and whether they will in fact be capable of just being confined to North Korea. And by the way, their cooperation on North Korea has been pretty good. I don't sense any double standards or double talk on that. They don't want the North Koreans to have a nuclear capability any more than anyone else does, and are doing, I think, their best to dissuade the North Koreans from going down that path. So China's a better story generally, and I think this all feeds into the mindset, which I think is very important for a US-China relations, important to develop, that the US shouldn't be obsessing about maintaining primacy and dominance and leadership and preeminence, but should be working on a much more collaborative, cooperative approach to future security, in which it's not a matter of yielding number one status, it's just a matter of not insisting on it and being prepared to accept some degree of equality. So I'm and the atmosphere in the Chinese conference room with, not only a handful of government people, they're mainly the sort of the think tank crowd, but the atmosphere was just so much more alert, sophisticated, encouraging, and sort of generally frank on these issues. So I came away feeling, maybe I'm naive, but I was more optimistic. In terms of you asked about the other weapon states, I mean, India and Pakistan is not a very good news story. Israel's a disaster story in terms of its willingness to do anything very helpful on this front. North Korea we know about. UK, France. The UK, I think, is the closest, and always has been the closest of the weapon states to taking the big step of just not, relying on nuclear weapons at all. It's flapping around in this twilight zone at the moment as to whether it will keep the tridents and whatever, and continuous at-sea deterrence of whom with what is the question to reasonably ask. All a gigantic cost to the taxpayer, and with no, but it's more a matter of the testosterone thing, the status thing. It's rather than any, being seen to be finally walking away from the one thing that gave it sort of global big boy status, and that's not going to happen. Even more so with the French. I mean, the French actually are true believers in nuclear weapons, and it's going to be a real problem at the end of the day if we ever get down to a serious move on zero to get the French to give them away. They genuinely believe these things are very important for national pride, prestige, status, and they say security. The US is probably the most sort of interesting in terms of the military versus political dimension of this. You've got a number of very, very sane senior military people who would really quite like to diminish quite dramatically reliance on nuclear weapons, not least because it stops them spending lots of things on other boys' toys, which they'd much prefer. But there's a genuine intellectual case for doing so. I mean, even Ash Carter, it should be remembered, not too many incarnations ago for him, he was in favour of getting rid of the land-based component of the triad completely. Now he's got religion again. Now he's back as Defence Secretary, and I don't suppose we'll see much rationality there. But I don't know how many of you were at the Carnegie conference a couple of weeks ago in Washington and heard General Hackensack. I mean, talking about the absolute, and he's the Strategic Air Command #2, I think. He's the really senior nuclear guy. And my God, there's a true believer for you if you think this is just a political, psychological thing. I mean, this is a guy really passionately believes in having every last ounce of nuclear armoury available to deal with every last contingency. And, George C. Scott, eat your heart out for those of you, if you heard the nostrils flaring defence of nuclear capability that came out there. So given all the psychology and the politics of this and, not yielding #1 status in the context of the presidential election, I'm not very hopeful. I mean, the big hope that we had was that Obama was absolutely serious. Well, Ronald Reagan was serious in his own way too, but Obama combined the emotional and the intellectual commitment. So, but he hasn't been able to deliver on anything that's mattered. So, it's not a good news story.
Let me just add here, following on to this. I think that when it comes to China, I think China has been literally flying under the radar screen. First of all, because they always align themselves, particularly in the disarmament sphere, with the non-aligned. And so I think that they've had a very low profile. And I attended a lecture some months ago, not so long ago, and where it basically was demonstrated that China had 100 nuclear weapons. I mean, that's a minimal posture. I mean, you showed 256, I think it was. But on the other hand, it's still very unclear what they have. But I think that I agree with your assessment about, the various countries and how they see it. So always the attention is on the US and the Russian Federation. And what has made it a little bit difficult now is because the Russians have also sort of said, well, look at conventionals at the same time. They have made the linkage, which is a very dangerous linkage, because, if you do that, then you'll never get to any agreement whatsoever, because then you make it a lot more complex as to what actually you're looking at. And when it comes to, what is the trade-off for each of the nuclear weapon states? I mean, to my mind, you asked, Jeff, whether it was political class or what. Well, I think, look at the military. Have you ever known any military, and you just talked about the nostrils flaring, etc. Have you ever known about a military who's willingly given up a weapon or a class of weapons unless there's been
In return for even more other weapons, yes, sometimes.
But anyway, so I think that is something that really is not. But the other thing, and you asked about Europe as well, and when you think about Europe being largely part of NATO and being under the NATO military doctrine, I mean, how do you square that circle? So how can the Europeans be very outspoken about this? Because on the other hand, they're part and parcel of this whole issue. So that makes it very difficult. One last word on 1540, because you gave the baton over to me. That was a resolution that was adopted by the Council 11 years ago. It has a very modest program. Most of the things that we do is implemented with voluntary contributions. There are very few funders. I mean, primarily the US and some other countries, Korea, for example, that have given us, the UN, quite a bit of money to do it. And there are various aspects to that. Can we actually prevent any nuclear material from being diverted into the wrong hands? Practically, no, we cannot. But we can do something that is very important. First of all, to have a baseline of countries. What do you actually have? What are you doing in this? And baseline studies, people sometimes smile at them and they say, oh, what do we need them? Well, let me tell you, in the case of Syria and the chemical weapons, it was extremely important that we had some baseline, that we could go back. And we said, but you said in year X, that's exactly what you said you had. And what happens now? So that's extremely important. And they're only, by now, I think they're only about a handful of 10 or 12 of states that haven't made the baseline. But if you think about the diversion, what does it mean? Diversion through ports, through borders, customs, there are a lot of areas that need to be taken, financial banks. So there are a lot of awareness raising and also practical tools that can be given to member states and to countries to beef up, so to say, their resources against a possible misuse of any materials.
Thank you. This has been a session of humbling realities, and one of them, Angela, is that when we tried to do this 2 years ago, as you pointed out, we got half the crowd we had today. The subject was the same. You were there, I was there. The difference is, of course, this year we had Gareth Evans with us. So by that way, let me say thank you very much for bringing this to IPI, and we're always happy when Angela came with us.